The military hospital buzzed with its usual controlled chaos as Dr. Sarah Chen walked through the corridors, her white coat flowing behind her. She had been working at the Naval Medical Center for 3 years now, treating wounded soldiers who returned from various missions around the world. Each day brought new faces, new stories, and new scars that told tales of courage and sacrifice. Sarah had always been drawn to helping others. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she watched her father struggle with his own war wounds from Vietnam. He never talked about what happened overseas, but she saw how the nightmares haunted him, how certain sounds made him jump, and how he sometimes stared into the distance with eyes that seemed to see things that weren't there. This experience shaped her desire to become a doctor, specifically one who could help military personnel heal both physically and emotionally. The morning started, like any other, when Sarah received word that a new group of patients would be arriving from a classified mission. She didn't ask questions about where they came from or what had happened. Her job was simple: provide the best medical care possible and help these brave men and women recover from their injuries. As she prepared the treatment rooms, Sarah noticed something different about this particular group. The nurses whispered among themselves, and even the senior doctors seemed more serious than usual. When she asked her colleague, Dr. Martinez, what was special about these incoming patients, he simply shook his head and said they were Navy SEALs who had been through something particularly difficult. The first ambulance arrived at exactly 1400 hours. Sarah watched from the window as the medical team carefully unloaded the first patient. Even unconscious and covered in bandages, the man looked incredibly strong and disciplined. His face bore the weathered look of someone who had seen combat multiple times, and his hands, even in sleep, seemed ready for action. One by one, more ambulances arrived. Sarah counted 12 patients in total, all men, all bearing the unmistakable bearing of elite military personnel. What struck her most was their silence. Even those who were conscious and able to speak barely said a word. They answered medical questions with short, clipped responses and seemed to communicate with each other through glances and subtle nods. As Sarah began examining her assigned patients, she noticed something unusual. Despite their obvious injuries, broken bones, shrapnel wounds, burns, and various other trauma, these men seemed almost emotionally shut down. They were polite and cooperative with the medical staff, but there was a wall around them that seemed impenetrable. The first patient Sarah treated was Petty Officer Johnson, a man in his early 30s with a severe leg injury that would require surgery. As she cleaned his wounds and prepared him for the operating room, she tried to make conversation to help him feel more comfortable. Most patients appreciated a friendly voice and some human connection during their treatment. "How are you feeling right now?" Sarah asked as she checked his vital signs. Johnson looked at her with intense blue eyes that seemed much older than his face. "I'm fine, Doc. Just fix the leg so I can get back to my team. You know, it's okay to talk about what happened. Sometimes it helps with the healing process," Sarah offered gently. Johnson's expression didn't change. "Nothing to talk about, ma'am. We did our job, things went sideways, and now we're here. That's all there is to it." Sarah had worked with many military patients before, and she understood that they were trained to be tough and not show weakness. But something about this group felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a shared burden that seemed to weigh on all of them equally. As the day progressed, Sarah moved from patient to patient, treating various injuries and trying to get a sense of what had happened to this team. Each man she spoke with gave similar responses, short, professional, and revealing nothing about the mission or their emotional state. During her lunch break, Sarah found herself thinking about her father again. She remembered how he used to sit on the back porch for hours just staring at the trees. Her mother would try to get him to talk, to share what was bothering him, but he would just shake his head and say that some things were better left unsaid. When Sarah returned to the ward, she noticed that the SEALs had been placed in rooms close to each other. Even though they were all injured and some were heavily medicated, they seemed to be keeping watch over one another. She observed how they would listen for sounds from neighboring rooms and how visitors to the ward were carefully observed by whichever team members were alert enough to do so. That evening, as Sarah was finishing her rounds, she overheard two of the SEALs talking quietly. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their voices carried as she walked past the partially open door. "How long do you think we'll be here?" one asked. "However long it takes," the other replied. "We stick together no matter what." "That's what we agreed. What about the reports?" Someone's going to want answers eventually. We tell them what we always tell them. Mission parameters changed, enemy contact was heavier than expected, and we adapted accordingly. Nothing more. Sarah paused in the hallway, struck by the tone of their conversation. These weren't just soldiers discussing a routine mission gone wrong. There was something deeper happening here, something that had bonded these men in a way that went beyond normal military camaraderie. As she continued her rounds, Sarah began to notice other small details. The way the men would stop talking when medical staff entered the room. How they seemed to have an unspoken agreement about what they would and wouldn't discuss. The protective way they watched over the most seriously injured members of their team. By the end of her first day treating this group, Sarah realized that she was dealing with something far more complex than typical combat injuries. These men were carrying a secret, and they were all committed to keeping it, no matter what the personal cost might be. That night, as Sarah drove home to her small apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to become part of something much bigger than she had ever anticipated. She thought about her father again and wondered if he had ever been part of a group like this, bound together by shared experiences that could never be spoken aloud. Little did Sarah know that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined, and that the silence of these 12 Navy SEALs would soon reveal a story that would challenge everything she thought she knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true cost of serving one's country. 3 days had passed since the Navy SEALs arrived at the hospital, and Dr. Sarah Chen found herself increasingly curious about their story. Their injuries were healing well, but their emotional walls seemed as strong as ever. She had treated many military personnel, but never had she encountered such a unified front of silence. The morning brought news that troubled Sarah. Chief Petty Officer Williams, one of the more seriously injured SEALs, had developed complications from his surgery. The infection in his shoulder wound was spreading and his fever had spiked during the night. As Sarah examined him, she noticed that despite his obvious pain and discomfort, Williams maintained the same stoic expression as his teammates. "Chief Williams, I need you to understand that this infection is serious," Sarah explained as she checked his temperature. "Your body is fighting hard right now and you need to help us help you. That means rest, proper nutrition, and following all medical instructions." Williams nodded weakly but managed to speak. "Doc, I appreciate what you're doing, but I need you to know that I can handle whatever comes my way. My team needs to see that I'm strong." Sarah looked at this tough man lying in the hospital bed, his body fighting an infection that could become life-threatening, yet still more concerned about appearing strong for his teammates than about his own health. She had seen dedication before, but this level of selflessness was remarkable. As she left Williams's room, Sarah noticed that several of his teammates were gathered in the hallway outside. They weren't supposed to be out of their beds, but somehow they had managed to position themselves where they could keep watch over their injured leader. When they saw Sarah approaching, they immediately began moving back toward their rooms. "Wait," Sarah called out softly. "You don't have to go. I understand that you're worried about Chief Williams." Petty Officer Johnson, whose leg injury Sarah had treated on the first day, turned back to face her. "How is he, Doc? And please, give it to us straight. We can handle the truth." Sarah looked at the faces surrounding her. These men had been through combat together, had trusted each other with their lives, and now they were asking her to trust them with the truth about their leader's condition. "The infection is serious, but we're treating it aggressively with antibiotics," Sarah explained. "The next 24 hours will be critical. If his body responds well to the treatment, he should start improving. If not, we may need to consider more intensive interventions." The men exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them communicating in that silent way she had observed since their arrival. Finally, Johnson spoke for the group. "Doc, is there anything we can do? I mean, we know we're patients too, but Chief Williams has been looking out for us for years. If there's any way we can help." Sarah was moved by their loyalty and concern for their leader. "The best thing you can do is take care of yourselves and get better. Chief Williams will recover faster, knowing that his team is healing properly." Over the next few hours, Sarah noticed changes in the SEAL team's behavior. They became more cooperative with the medical staff, more willing to follow treatment protocols, and more focused on their own recovery. It was as if Johnson had passed along a message to the entire team, reminding them that their own healing was connected to their leader's well-being. That afternoon, Sarah was called to examine Petty Officer Rodriguez, who had been suffering from severe headaches since his arrival. The head trauma he had sustained during the mission was healing, but he was experiencing memory issues and confusion that concerned the medical team. "Rodriguez, can you tell me what you remember about the past few days?" Sarah asked as she conducted a neurological assessment. Rodriguez struggled to focus, his eyes showing the strain of someone trying to reach through a fog. I remember being with my team. We were doing something important. But the details are fuzzy, Doc. It's like trying to remember a dream." Sarah had seen this type of head trauma before. Sometimes the memory loss was temporary, and sometimes it was permanent. What concerned her more was the look of panic that crossed Rodriguez's face when he realized he couldn't remember clearly. "It's okay," Sarah reassured him. "Memory issues after head trauma are normal. Your brain is healing, and sometimes that process affects how we store and retrieve memories." "But Doc, what if I can't remember what happened on the mission? What if I can't remember something important that my team needs me to remember?" Before Sarah could answer, Johnson appeared in the doorway. He must have heard Rodriguez's distressed voice and come to check on his teammate. "Hey, Rodriguez," Johnson said calmly as he entered the room. "How are you feeling, brother?" "I can't remember, Johnson. I can't remember what happened out there. What if I'm supposed to know something important?" Johnson moved closer to Rodriguez's bed, and Sarah watched as the injured SEAL's face transformed. The professional military bearing was still there, but now there was also genuine care and brotherhood. "Listen to me carefully," Johnson said firmly but kindly. "You don't need to remember anything right now. Your job is to get better. The mission is over, we're all safe, and that's what matters. Whatever happened out there, we've got it handled." Sarah observed this interaction with fascination. Johnson was clearly providing more than medical comfort to his teammate. He was offering reassurance about something specific, something related to their shared experience. "Are you sure?" Rodriguez asked, his voice showing his vulnerability. "I'm absolutely sure," Johnson replied. "You did your job perfectly out there. Now your job is to heal. Trust me on this." After Johnson helped settle Rodriguez down and returned to his own room, Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation she had just witnessed. There was obviously something significant about their mission that was weighing on all of these men. Rodriguez's concern about remembering something important suggested that there might be details about their operation that were crucial in some way. That evening, as Sarah was completing her notes, she received a visit from Captain Morrison, the hospital's commanding officer. Morrison rarely involved himself in individual patient care, so his presence in the SEAL ward was unusual. "Dr. Chen, I wanted to speak with you about your current patients," Morrison said as he closed the door to the small office where Sarah was working. "Of course, Captain. Is there something specific you need to know about their medical progress?" Morrison sat down across from her, his expression serious. "I've been receiving inquiries about these men from some very high-ranking officials. There seems to be quite a bit of interest in their mission and their current condition." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "I've been providing regular medical updates through the normal channels. Is there something more you need?" "The inquiries aren't just about their physical injuries," Morrison explained carefully. "There are questions about their mental state, their ability to recall events, and their willingness to cooperate with debriefings." Sarah thought about Rodriguez's memory issues and the team's unified silence about their mission. "Captain, these men are my patients. My primary concern is their medical care and recovery. Any other considerations would need to go through appropriate medical and legal channels." Morrison nodded slowly. "I understand your position, Doctor. Just be aware that this situation may become more complicated in the coming days. These men may have been involved in something that has attracted attention at the highest levels of government." As Captain Morrison left, Sarah sat alone in the small office, her mind racing. She thought about her 12 patients, their mysterious silence, their fierce loyalty to each other, and now the revelation that their mission had attracted high-level government attention. Whatever had happened during their operation, it was clear that the story was far from over. That night, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She kept thinking about the look in Rodriguez's eyes when he couldn't remember, Johnson's careful reassurances, and Chief Williams fighting an infection while still worrying about his team. These men were protecting something, and Sarah was beginning to realize that she might be the only person in a position to help them do it. The fourth day brought unexpected visitors to the hospital. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at work to find 2 men in dark suits waiting in the SEAL ward. They introduced themselves as Agent Parker and Agent Stevens from an unnamed government agency, and they requested permission to interview the patients about their recent mission. Sarah immediately felt protective of her patients. She had seen how fragile some of them were, especially Rodriguez with his memory issues and Chief Williams who was still fighting his infection. The idea of these men being pressured to relive their traumatic experience while they were trying to heal troubled her deeply. "Gentlemen, I appreciate that you have a job to do, but these men are still recovering from serious injuries," Sarah explained as she stood between the agents and the patient rooms. Any interviews would need to be approved by their doctors and conducted under medical supervision. Agent Parker, a tall man with cold gray eyes, smiled thinly. "Doctor, I think you misunderstand the importance of this situation. These men were involved in an operation that has national security implications. We need to debrief them as soon as possible. Then you'll need to wait until they're medically cleared for such activities," Sarah replied firmly. "Some of these men have head trauma. Others are on strong pain medications and their leader is fighting a serious infection. None of them are in condition to provide reliable testimony right now." Agent Stevens stepped forward, his manner slightly more diplomatic than his partner's. "Dr. Chen, perhaps we could start with the less seriously injured members of the team. Just a few questions to help us understand what happened during their mission." Sarah shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I cannot allow any patient interviews until the attending physician determines that each individual is physically and mentally ready. That's standard medical protocol, and it's non-negotiable." As the agents reluctantly left, promising to return with proper authorization, Sarah went to check on her patients. She found them more alert and watchful than usual. Word had clearly spread about the government visitors, and the SEALs were on high alert. When Sarah entered Chief Williams's room to check on his infection, she found him sitting up in bed despite doctor's orders to rest. His fever had broken during the night, which was encouraging, but he still looked weak and tired. "Chief, you should be lying down," Sarah said as she began her examination. "Your body is still fighting this infection." Williams looked at her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Doc, I heard we had some visitors this morning. Government types asking questions." Sarah was surprised by how quickly information traveled among the team, even when they were confined to separate rooms. "Yes, but I told them that none of you are ready for interviews yet. You need to focus on getting better, Dr. Chen," Williams said quietly. "I need you to understand something. What happened on our last mission? It's complicated. There are things that happened out there that could be misunderstood if they're not explained properly." Sarah sat down in the chair beside his bed. "Chief, whatever happened, it's not my place to judge. My job is to help you heal, but I want you to know that I won't let anyone pressure you or your team while you're under my care." William studied her face for a long moment. "You remind me of someone, Doc. Someone who cared more about doing what was right than following orders." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Johnson appeared in the doorway. Even with his leg injury, he had managed to make his way from his room to check on his team leader. "Chief, how are you feeling?" Johnson asked, but his eyes were focused on Sarah, clearly wondering what they had been discussing. "Better," Williams replied. "Dr. Chen here just told me she's keeping the government boys away until we're ready to talk." Johnson's expression showed both gratitude and concern. "Doc, I appreciate that, but you should know that these people don't give up easily. They'll find a way to get what they want eventually." Sarah looked between the two men. What exactly are they looking for? "What happened on your mission that has everyone so interested?" The two SEALs exchanged one of their silent communications, and Sarah could see them deciding how much, if anything, to tell her. Finally, Williams spoke. "Doc, have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between following orders and doing what you knew was right?" Sarah thought about her father, about the stories he never told but the pain he carried. "Not in the way you mean, but I understand that sometimes those choices aren't clear-cut. Our last mission started as a routine operation," Johnson said carefully. "We were supposed to extract a high-value target from a compound in a hostile area. Intelligence said it was a terrorist leader responsible for multiple attacks on American forces. Williams picked up the story, but when we got there, when we found our target, things weren't what they seemed." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. These men were finally opening up to her, trusting her with information that others were desperate to obtain. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Johnson looked toward the door, making sure they weren't being overheard. The terrorist leader we were supposed to capture was actually an American intelligence asset, someone who had been working undercover for months, providing crucial information that had saved hundreds of lives. But our orders were clear. Williams continued. Extract the target, no questions asked. The problem was taking him out of there would have blown his cover and put dozens of other operatives at risk. Sarah began to understand the weight these men were carrying. So you had to choose between following your mission orders and protecting an intelligence operation. It gets worse, Johnson said grimly. While we were trying to figure out what to do, the compound came under attack from actual enemy forces. Our guy got caught in the crossfire. Williams' voice became heavy with emotion. We tried to save him, Doc. We fought like hell to get him out of there. But he didn't make it. I'm so sorry, Sarah said, finally understanding the grief she had sensed in these men since their arrival. The thing is, Johnson continued, officially our mission was a success. We eliminated a high-value terrorist target. The government wants to use our operation as an example of successful counterterrorism. But you know the truth, Sarah said. We know that a good man died because someone in intelligence didn't communicate properly with someone in operations, Williams said bitterly. And now they want us to go along with the cover story, to let them turn a tragedy into a victory. Sarah sat in silence for a moment, processing what she had just learned. These 12 men weren't just dealing with physical injuries from their mission. They were carrying the weight of a moral dilemma that had cost a good man his life. What are you going to do? She asked. Williams and Johnson looked at each other again, and Sarah could see the burden they shared with their teammates. We've agreed to stick together, Johnson said. We tell the truth about what happened, or we don't say anything at all. No one gets thrown under the bus, and we don't let them turn this into propaganda. Even if it costs you your careers? Sarah asked. Some things are more important than careers, Doc, Williams replied, like being able to look at yourself in the mirror every morning. As Sarah left their room, she realized that these men weren't just her patients anymore. They were 12 individuals who had made a collective decision to sacrifice their own futures rather than participate in covering up a tragedy. Their silence wasn't about protecting themselves. It was about protecting the truth and honoring the memory of a fallen colleague. That evening, Sarah found herself thinking about courage in a new way. She had always admired the bravery of soldiers who faced enemy fire, but now she was witnessing a different kind of courage, the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the consequences could destroy everything you've worked for. She thought about her father again, and for the first time, she wondered if his silence had been about protecting truth rather than hiding from it. The next morning brought more pressure than Dr. Sarah Chen had anticipated. Agent Parker returned with Agent Stevens, this time accompanied by a Navy admiral and a representative from the Pentagon. They had medical clearance orders signed by officials much higher up the chain of command than anyone at the hospital. Sarah found herself in Captain Morrison's office, facing a room full of people who clearly outranked everyone in the building. The admiral, a stern woman in her 50s with piercing brown eyes, spoke first. Dr. Chen, we appreciate your dedication to your patients' welfare, but this matter has implications that extend far beyond this hospital. These men have information that is crucial to ongoing national security operations. Sarah felt intimidated but stood her ground. Admiral, I understand the importance of the situation, but some of these men are still not medically ready for intensive questioning. Chief Williams just recovered from a serious infection yesterday, and Petty Officer Rodriguez is still experiencing memory issues from his head trauma. Agent Parker leaned forward in his chair. Dr. Chen, perhaps you don't fully understand what's at stake here. The operation these men conducted resulted in the elimination of a high-value terrorist target. We need their testimony to confirm operational details for congressional briefings and international intelligence sharing. Sarah thought about her conversation with Williams and Johnson the day before. She knew that the official story these officials wanted to hear was very different from what had actually happened. I can clear 2 or 3 of the less seriously injured men for brief interviews, Sarah offered, trying to buy time for her patients. But any questioning must be limited to 30 minutes, conducted in the presence of medical personnel, and stopped immediately if the patient shows signs of distress. The Pentagon representative, a man in civilian clothes who had been silent until now, spoke up. That's acceptable for a start. We'll begin this afternoon with the 3 men you select. After the officials left, Sarah went directly to the SEAL ward. She needed to warn her patients about what was coming and prepare them for the interviews. When she arrived, she found the entire team gathered in Chief Williams' room, despite medical orders for bed rest. "We heard the commotion from the captain's office," Johnson said as soon as Sarah entered. "They're coming for us, aren't they?" Sarah nodded. "I managed to limit it to 3 of you for now, and only for 30 minutes each with medical supervision. But they have orders from very high up. I can't protect you much longer." Chief Williams, despite being the weakest of the group, took charge of the situation. "Doc, we appreciate everything you've done for us. More than you know. But we always knew this day would come. What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, genuinely concerned for these men who had trusted her with their story. "We stick to our agreement," Williams replied firmly. "We tell the truth, the whole truth, or we say nothing at all." Petty Officer Martinez, who had been quiet since his arrival, spoke up. "Doc, there's something you should know about the man we lost over there. His name was Lieutenant David Park, and he was one of the best intelligence operatives our country ever had." Johnson continued the story. "Park had been undercover for 8 months, living among the enemy, feeding us information that prevented at least 6 major terrorist attacks. He saved hundreds of lives. When we found him in that compound, he was trying to warn us about the intelligence failure that had put his mission at risk," Williams added. "Instead of extracting him safely, we walked into a trap that cost him his life." Sarah listened as the team members took turns sharing details about their fallen colleague. It became clear that Lieutenant Park had been more than just an asset to them. He had become a friend, someone they respected and admired for his courage and dedication. "The thing is," Rodriguez said, his memory apparently clearer when talking about his lost teammate, "Park made us promise something before he died. He made us swear that we wouldn't let his sacrifice be turned into a lie." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "He knew that the official story would be that we successfully eliminated a terrorist," Martinez explained. "But Park wasn't a terrorist. He was an American hero, and he died because someone screwed up the intelligence chain. He deserves better than being remembered as the enemy." Sarah began to understand the full weight of the moral burden these men were carrying. They weren't just protecting their own integrity. They were protecting the memory and honor of a fallen comrade. That afternoon, the interviews began. Sarah had selected Johnson, Martinez, and Petty Officer Thompson as the 3 most physically ready for questioning. She insisted on being present during each interview to monitor their medical condition. The first interview was with Johnson. Agent Parker and Agent Stevens conducted the questioning, while Sarah observed from the corner of the room. The questions started simple, asking about mission parameters, team composition, and timeline of events. Johnson answered each question carefully and truthfully, but Sarah noticed that he was providing only the most basic factual information. When the agents asked about the target they had been sent to extract, Johnson's responses became even more careful. "Can you describe the target when you first encountered him?" Agent Parker asked. Johnson paused for a long moment. "The individual we encountered in the compound was not what we expected based on our briefing materials." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that the intelligence we had been given was incomplete or incorrect." Agent Stevens leaned forward. "Are you saying the target was not the terrorist leader you were sent to capture?" Johnson looked directly at the agent. "I'm saying that the situation on the ground was more complex than our briefing had indicated." Sarah watched as the agents became increasingly frustrated with Johnson's careful non-answers. He was technically telling the truth but refusing to provide the specific details they wanted. The interview with Martinez went similarly. He confirmed basic operational details but refused to elaborate on the nature of their target or the circumstances of his death. When pressed for more specific information, Martinez simply stated that he would need to review classified materials before providing detailed testimony. Thompson's interview was the most challenging. The agents seemed to sense that he might be more willing to provide the information they needed. They spent considerable time asking him about the moment when their target was killed and whether the team had confirmed his identity. "Petty Officer Thompson, it's important for national security that we have accurate information about this operation," Agent Parker said in a more friendly tone. "Can you confirm that your team successfully eliminated the terrorist leader Hassan al-Mansouri?" Thompson looked at the agent for a long moment, then at Sarah, and finally back at the agent. "I can confirm that an individual died during our operation. As for his identity and the circumstances of his death, I would prefer to provide that information in a formal debriefing with my full team present. After the interviews concluded, the agents huddled with the Admiral and the Pentagon representative. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation, and it was clear they were not satisfied with the information they had received. That evening, Sarah found the SEAL team members who had been interviewed sitting together in the common area of the ward. They looked drained, not physically but emotionally. How did it go? Chief Williams asked when Sarah approached. You told the truth without giving them what they wanted, Sarah observed. But they're not going to give up. They'll keep pushing until they get the story they need. Johnson nodded grimly. We know. The question is, how long can we hold out before they start making threats about our careers, our benefits, our families? Sarah realized that these men were facing an impossible situation. They were being asked to choose between their integrity and their futures, between honoring their fallen colleague and protecting their own lives. Is there anything I can do to help? Sarah asked. Williams looked at her with something that might have been hope. Doc, you've already done more than you know. You've given us time to stay unified, time to think about how we want to handle this. Most importantly, you've shown us that there are still people who care more about doing what's right than following orders. As Sarah left the ward that evening, she knew that the real test was yet to come. The government officials would return with more pressure, more authority, and fewer options for her patients. The 12 Navy SEALs were running out of time to maintain their protective silence, and Sarah was beginning to wonder if there was anything she could do to help them preserve both their integrity and their futures. Dr. Sarah Chen couldn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about the impossible situation her patients were facing and her father's words from years ago about doing what's right, even when it's difficult. At 3 a.m, she made a decision that would change everything. Sarah drove to the hospital and used her access card to enter the SEAL ward. She found Chief Williams awake, staring out the window at the moonlit parking lot. When he saw her, he wasn't surprised. Couldn't sleep either, Doc? He asked quietly. Chief, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, Sarah said as she sat down beside his bed. If there was a way to tell Lieutenant Park's story, the real story, without destroying your careers or compromising ongoing operations, would you want that? Williams studied her face carefully. What are you thinking, Doc? I'm thinking that sometimes the truth needs an advocate, someone who isn't bound by military orders or government pressure, someone who can speak freely because they're not part of the system. Williams was quiet for several minutes, considering her words. Doc, what you're suggesting could be dangerous for you. These people don't like it when civilians interfere with their operations. Let me worry about that, Sarah replied. Right now I'm more concerned about 12 good men being forced to choose between their integrity and their futures. The next morning, Sarah began her own investigation into Lieutenant David Park. Using her medical credentials and connections, she started gathering information about the intelligence operative who had died during the SEAL team's mission. What she discovered both amazed and horrified her. Park had been born in Korea but adopted by an American family when he was 5 years old. He had grown up in California, excelled in school, and joined the military after graduating from college with degrees in linguistics and international relations. Park's service record was impressive. He had completed multiple tours in various hotspots around the world, always volunteering for the most dangerous assignments. His specialty was deep cover intelligence work, spending months or even years embedded with enemy organizations to gather crucial information. Through her research, Sarah learned that Park's intelligence had been directly responsible for preventing several major terrorist attacks, including one that would have targeted a school in Germany and another that would have hit a hospital in France. He had saved countless innocent lives through his work. But the most shocking discovery came when Sarah found Park's personal file. Listed as his emergency contact was Dr. James Chen, her own father. That evening, Sarah confronted her father at his home. She found him in his usual spot on the back porch, staring into the distance with those haunted eyes she remembered from her childhood. Dad, we need to talk about Lieutenant David Park, Sarah said as she sat down beside him. Her father's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands tighten on the arms of his chair. How do you know that name? He's listed you as his emergency contact. He died during a mission last week, and I'm treating the Navy SEALs who were with him when it happened. For the first time in Sarah's memory, she saw tears in her father's eyes. David is dead? Yes, Dad, and the government wants to cover up how he died. They want to pretend he was a terrorist instead of honoring him as the hero he really was. Her father was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. David Park was the son I never had. When his adoptive parents died in a car accident 8 years ago, he had no one. I became his emergency contact because he needed someone who understood the cost of serving in shadows. Sarah felt her world shifting as she realized the connection between her father's pain and her current patients. Dad, is this why you never talked about your service? Were you involved in intelligence work too? Different war, same kinds of operations, her father replied. I lost friends whose sacrifices could never be acknowledged, whose families never knew the truth about how they died. David reminded me of those men, and I promised myself I would be there for him if he ever needed someone. He needs someone now. Dad. Those SEALs are being pressured to lie about his death, to let the government turn him into a villain, instead of remembering him as a hero. Her father turned to look at her directly for the first time in the conversation. What are you planning to do, Sarah? I'm going to make sure his story gets told. The real story. The next morning, Sarah returned to the hospital with a new sense of purpose. She gathered the SEAL team in Chief Williams's room and shared what she had learned about Lieutenant Park's background and his connection to her father. So you see, Sarah concluded, this isn't just about protecting your careers or following orders. This is about honoring a man who spent his life serving his country in the shadows, never getting recognition for the lives he saved. Johnson spoke first. Doc, your father sounds like a good man, and we appreciate what you're trying to do. But how can you tell Park's story without putting yourself at risk? Sarah had been thinking about this question all night. I have connections in the medical community, relationships with journalists who cover military affairs, and access to information that isn't classified. I can build a case for Park's heroism without revealing operational details. Chief Williams leaned forward in his bed. What would you need from us? Personal stories about Park, details about his character, his dedication, his sacrifice. Information that shows who he really was as a person, not just as an operative. Over the next few hours, the SEALs shared their memories of Lieutenant Park. They told Sarah about his sense of humor, his dedication to his mission, his concern for the safety of other operatives, and his final words asking them to remember him as he truly was. Rodriguez, whose memory had been improving daily, provided crucial details about Park's warning to the team about the intelligence failure. He knew something was wrong with the operation from the beginning. He tried to warn us, tried to get us to abort the mission, but our communications were compromised. Martinez added, Park saved our lives that day. When the compound came under attack, he could have tried to escape on his own. Instead, he stayed to help us fight our way out. He died covering our retreat. Thompson, who had been the quietest member of the team, finally spoke up. Park made us promise that if anything happened to him, we wouldn't let them turn his death into propaganda. He said the truth was more important than any operation. As Sarah listened to these stories, she began to see a complete picture of David Park as both a skilled operative and a deeply principled man. She also began to understand why these 12 SEALs were willing to sacrifice their own careers to protect his memory. That afternoon, the government officials returned for more interviews. This time, they brought additional pressure in the form of threats about security clearances, military benefits, and potential court-martial proceedings. Sarah watched as Agent Parker became increasingly aggressive in his questioning, pushing the SEALs to provide the specific confirmation of Park's terrorist identity that would support the official story. Gentlemen, let me be very clear, Parker said to the assembled team. Your silence is not protecting anyone at this point. We have other sources that confirm the identity of your target. We're simply asking you to corroborate information we already possess. Chief Williams, despite still being weak from his infection, responded with quiet dignity. Agent Parker, if you already have confirmation of the target's identity from other sources, then you don't need our testimony. That's not how this works, Parker replied angrily. You were the operational team. Your testimony carries weight that other sources don't have. Johnson stepped forward. Then you'll have to find another way to get that weight, because we're not going to lie about what happened. As the confrontation escalated, Sarah realized that her patients were reaching a breaking point. The government officials were not going to accept their silence much longer. and the SEALs were not going to break their promise to their fallen colleague. That evening, Sarah made another decision that would change the course of events. She called her father and asked him to come to the hospital. It was time for James Chen to meet the 12 men who had been with David Park in his final moments. The reunion between her father and the SEAL team was emotional and powerful. These men who had maintained such strict control over their emotions finally had someone who understood their loss and their commitment to honoring Park's memory. As Sarah watched her father embrace each of the SEALs, she knew that she had found the key to resolving this crisis. The truth about David Park would be told, but it would be told by people who loved him, not by government officials who wanted to use his death for their own purposes. The meeting between James Chen and the 12 Navy SEALs was unlike anything Dr. Sarah Chen had ever witnessed. Her father, who had been silent about his military service for decades, suddenly came alive as he spoke with the men who had served alongside David Park. "David used to tell me about his teammates," James said as he sat with the group in Chief Williams's room. He said that the hardest part of his job wasn't the danger or the isolation. It was knowing that if something happened to him, the people he cared about might never know the truth about who he really was. Chief Williams, who had been the team's unofficial leader throughout their hospital stay, spoke first. "Mr. Chen, David was one of the finest men I've ever served with. He died trying to protect an intelligence network that had taken him years to build. He deserves better than being remembered as the enemy." James nodded, understanding completely. "In my day, we lost good men whose families were told they died in training accidents or equipment failures. Their real sacrifices could never be acknowledged because the missions were too sensitive. I promised myself that if I ever had the chance to honor one of these forgotten heroes, I would take it." Sarah watched as her father transformed from the haunted, silent man she had known all her life into someone with purpose and determination. For the first time, she understood that his silence hadn't been about weakness or inability to cope. It had been about protecting secrets that weren't his to tell. "What do you think we should do?" Johnson asked James. "We tell David's story the right way," James replied firmly. "Not through government channels or official reports, but through the people who knew him best. We let the world know who David Park really was." Over the next few days, James worked with Sarah and the SEAL team to document David Park's real story. They gathered personal anecdotes, examples of his heroism, and evidence of the lives he had saved through his intelligence work. Sarah used her medical connections to reach out to Dr. Margaret Foster, a journalist who specialized in military affairs and had a reputation for thorough, accurate reporting. Dr. Foster had previously written several articles about the challenges facing veterans and the importance of honoring military service. When Dr. Foster arrived at the hospital, she was initially skeptical. Stories about government cover-ups and heroic operatives were common, and many turned out to be exaggerated or completely false. But as she listened to the testimony of 12 Navy SEALs and examined the documentation that James and Sarah had gathered, she began to understand that this story was different. "This is an extraordinary situation," Dr. Foster said after spending 2 days interviewing the team members. "You're asking me to publish a story that directly contradicts an official government operation. Do you understand the implications of that?" Chief Williams, who had become the spokesman for the group, answered carefully. "Dr. Foster, we're not asking you to compromise national security or reveal classified information. We're asking you to tell the truth about a good man who died serving his country. The story I would write would focus on David Park as a person," Dr. Foster explained. "His background, his character, his dedication to protecting innocent lives. I wouldn't include operational details or classified information. But even a story like that could create problems for all of you." Johnson leaned forward in his wheelchair. "Dr. Foster, we've already accepted that telling the truth might cost us our careers. What we can't accept is letting David be remembered as something he wasn't." Dr. Foster spent several more hours with the team, asking detailed questions about David Park's character and getting specific examples of his heroism. She also interviewed James Chen about his relationship with Park and his decision to support the team's efforts to honor their fallen colleague. "Mr. Chen, you've been silent about your own military service for decades," Dr. Foster observed. "Why are you willing to speak publicly now?" James looked at the 12 SEALs who had accepted him as one of their own. "Because these men reminded me what courage really looks like. It's not just about facing the enemy in combat. It's about standing up for what's right even when it costs you everything." As Dr. Foster prepared to leave the hospital, She made a commitment that would change everything. "I'm going to write this story," she announced, "and I'm going to make sure it gets the attention it deserves." Meanwhile, the government pressure on the SEAL team was intensifying. Agent Parker and Agent Stevens returned with even higher-ranking officials and more serious threats. The Pentagon representative who had been present in earlier meetings now spoke of potential criminal charges if the team continued to refuse cooperation. "Gentlemen, you are walking a very dangerous line," the Pentagon official warned during a tense meeting in the hospital conference room. Refusing to cooperate with an official debriefing could be construed as insubordination or even treason. Chief Williams, despite still being weak from his recent infection, stood to address the official. "Sir, with all due respect, we have never refused to cooperate. We have answered every question truthfully. If our answers don't match the story you want to hear, that's not our problem. Your truthful answers have been vague and unhelpful," Agent Parker interjected. "We need specific confirmation that your target was the terrorist Hassan al-Mansouri." Rodriguez, whose memory had been steadily improving, spoke up for the first time in any of the official meetings. "Agent Parker, I can confirm that the individual who died during our operation was not Hassan al-Mansouri. He was Lieutenant David Park, an American intelligence operative." The room fell silent. Rodriguez had just directly contradicted the official story that the government had been trying to establish. The Pentagon official's face turned red with anger. "Petty Officer Rodriguez, you are making a very serious accusation. Are you certain about this identification?" "Absolutely certain," Rodriguez replied firmly. "David Park was my friend. I would never mistake him for someone else." Agent Stevens leaned forward aggressively. "You're saying that American forces killed an American operative?" Johnson stepped in to clarify. "We're saying that Lieutenant Park died defending his position against enemy forces, while trying to protect an intelligence operation that had been compromised by faulty planning. The government officials demanded immediate access to all medical records, psychological evaluations, and any other documentation related to the SEAL team. They also threatened to transfer the entire team to a military facility where interviews could be conducted without civilian medical oversight." That evening, Sarah found herself facing the most difficult decision of her career. The government officials had the authority to remove her patients from her care, but she also had a responsibility to protect their welfare and their rights. She called an emergency meeting with Captain Morrison, the hospital's legal counsel, and the chief of staff. "I have reason to believe that transferring these patients to military custody at this time would be detrimental to their medical recovery and their legal rights," Sarah explained. "Dr. Chen, you're putting yourself in this hospital in a very difficult position," Captain Morrison warned. "These orders come from the highest levels of government. Then the highest levels of government will have to explain why they're interfering with medical care for wounded service members," Sarah replied firmly. That night, James Chen sat with his daughter in the hospital cafeteria, both of them knowing that the next day would bring a confrontation that could change their lives forever. "Sarah, I'm proud of what you're doing," James said quietly. "But you need to understand that once you take a stand like this, there's no going back. These people have long memories. Dad, 30 years ago, you and David Park's friends made sacrifices that could never be acknowledged. Today, I have the chance to make sure that David's sacrifice is remembered properly. How can I not take that chance?" James smiled at his daughter, seeing in her the same courage that had driven him and his fellow soldiers decades earlier. "Then we'd better make sure we do this right." As they sat together, both of them knew that tomorrow would bring the final confrontation between the 12 Navy SEALs and the government officials who wanted to control their story. The question was whether the truth about David Park would survive that confrontation. The final confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the hospital to find military police securing the SEAL ward. Agent Parker and a team of officials had arrived early with orders to transfer all 12 patients to a secure military facility for enhanced debriefing procedures. Sarah immediately called the hospital's legal counsel and demanded an emergency hearing before any patients were moved. She argued that the transfer would be medically harmful to several team members who were still recovering from serious injuries. "Your Honor," Sarah addressed the federal judge who had been called in for the emergency hearing, "Chief Williams is still at risk for infection complications. Petty Officer Rodriguez continues to have memory issues from his head trauma, and several other patients require ongoing medical monitoring. Moving them at this time could seriously compromise their recovery. The government's attorney countered aggressively. Your Honor, these men are not ordinary patients. They are military personnel who possess information vital to national security. Their medical needs can be adequately addressed at a secure facility. What the government officials didn't know was that Dr. Margaret Foster's article about David Park had been published that morning in a major newspaper. The story, titled "The Hero They Want to Forget," detailed Park's background, his intelligence work, and his ultimate sacrifice to protect other operatives. As the legal hearing continued, Sarah's phone began buzzing with messages. The story was spreading rapidly across social media and being picked up by other news outlets. Dr. Foster had done exactly what she promised. She had told David Park's story in a way that honored his service without compromising operational security. The article included interviews with the SEAL team members, focusing on Park's character and heroism rather than classified details. It described how an American intelligence operative had spent months infiltrating terrorist networks, providing information that had saved hundreds of lives, and ultimately died trying to protect his fellow Americans. Most importantly, the article raised questions about why the government was trying to classify Park as a terrorist rather than honoring him as a hero. Judge Harrison, who was presiding over the emergency hearing, called a recess when news of the article reached the courtroom. When proceedings resumed, the atmosphere had completely changed. It appears that the circumstances of this case have evolved significantly, Judge Harrison noted. Given the public attention this matter has now received, I'm ordering that these patients remain under civilian medical care until their conditions are fully stabilized. Agent Parker was furious. Your Honor, this article contains classified information that could compromise ongoing operations. Agent Parker, I've read the article in question, the judge replied firmly. It contains personal testimonies about a deceased service member's character and dedication. If that constitutes classified information in your opinion, then perhaps you need to reconsider how you classify heroism. As news of the legal victory spread through the hospital, Sarah found the SEAL team gathered in Chief Williams' room, watching news coverage of Dr. Foster's article on television. For the first time since their arrival, she saw genuine smiles on their faces. "Doc, you did it," Johnson said as Sarah entered the room. "David's story is finally being told the right way." "We all did it," Sarah replied. "Every one of you stayed strong and stood by your principles when it would have been easier to give in." Chief Williams, who was finally showing real signs of recovery from his infection, spoke for the group. "Dr. Chen, what you and your father did for us goes beyond medical care. You gave us the chance to honor our friend's memory properly." Over the next few days, the story continued to grow. Veterans organizations praised the SEAL team for their integrity and called for David Park to be posthumously honored for his service. Members of Congress began asking questions about why a decorated intelligence operative was being classified as a terrorist in official reports. The government officials, who had been pressuring the team, quietly withdrew their demands for enhanced debriefing. The Pentagon announced that David Park would be posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his intelligence work and his sacrifice in the line of duty. James Chen, who had broken his decades-long silence about military service, became an advocate for other veterans whose sacrifices had been classified or forgotten. He worked with Dr. Foster to establish a foundation dedicated to honoring intelligence operatives and special operations personnel whose heroism couldn't be publicly acknowledged during their lifetimes. As the SEAL team members recovered from their injuries and prepared to return to duty, they maintained the close bond that had sustained them through their ordeal. They had proven that loyalty to a fallen comrade and commitment to truth could overcome even the most powerful government pressure. Rodriguez, whose memory had fully returned, became the team's unofficial historian, ensuring that David Park's story would be preserved for future generations of special operations personnel. "He taught us that being a warrior isn't just about fighting the enemy," Rodriguez explained to Dr. Foster in a follow-up interview. "It's about protecting the things that matter most, even when no one will ever know you did it." 6 months later, Sarah received an invitation to attend the dedication of the Lieutenant David Park Memorial Garden at the Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of service members, intelligence operatives, and family members of those who had served in classified operations. As Sarah sat with her father and the 12 Navy SEALs who had become like family to her, she watched the unveiling of a memorial that honored not just David Park, but all the men and women who had served their country in shadows and silence. Chief Williams, now fully recovered and back to active duty, spoke at the ceremony. Lieutenant Park understood that true heroism often goes unrecognized. But he also believed that truth has a way of finding its voice when good people are willing to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The inscription on the memorial read, "In honor of those who serve in silence, sacrifice in secret, and find their reward in the knowledge that their courage protects the innocent." As Sarah looked at the faces of the SEAL team members, she saw men who had been forever changed by their experience. They had learned that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against the forces that would compromise truth and honor for convenience. Johnson, who had become a close friend during the months of recovery, approached Sarah after the ceremony. "Doc, I wanted you to know that what you did for us changed more than just our situation. It reminded us why we serve in the first place." "You reminded me of something too," Sarah replied. "My father carried the weight of unspoken truths for 30 years. Watching you 12 men stand up for what was right showed me that silence isn't always strength. Sometimes courage means finding your voice and using it to protect the truth." That evening, as Sarah and her father drove home from the ceremony, James Chen spoke about his military service for the first time in decades. He told his daughter about operations that had saved lives but could never be acknowledged, about friends who had died as heroes but were officially listed as training casualties, and about the burden of carrying secrets that honored the dead by keeping them. "Sarah, what you did for David Park and those SEALs gave me something I never thought I'd have," James said as they pulled into their driveway. "What's that, Dad?" "The chance to finally honor my friends properly. The foundation we're building will make sure that other heroes like David don't disappear into classified files and forgotten reports." As Sarah looked at her father, she saw a man who had found peace after decades of carrying unspoken burdens. The 12 Navy SEALs had kept their promise to honor their fallen colleague, and in doing so, they had helped heal wounds that went back generations. The story of Lieutenant David Park became a symbol of the courage required to stand up for truth, even when powerful forces try to silence it. And the 12 Navy SEALs who stayed silent when it mattered most had ultimately found their voices when it mattered even more. Years later, when new generations of special operations personnel faced similar moral dilemmas, they would remember the story of the team that chose honor over convenience, truth over expediency, and loyalty to a fallen friend over their own career advancement. David Park's sacrifice had saved lives during his intelligence operations, but the courage of his teammates in honoring his memory had saved something even more precious: the principle that heroism deserves recognition, truth deserves protection, and some promises are worth keeping no matter what the cost.